residents of the United States, including Canada. Okay? So as corporations rule the world, you are doomed, okay? Unless we fight back. And actually, along that line, I want to say a couple of words, if I may, just a couple of words of reflection on the stories that you've shared with us, for which I thank you a lot. In each one of those stories of private pain, there is, as always, a reflection of the public issues that we have to deal with. Every single one of them. For example, we heard people telling stories about the blame and shame of the conditions in which they're living. Bed bugs, by the way, are, in fact, a huge problem throughout the world. And they do not affect only poor people. But it's only poor people who have to rely on public services or on meager incomes in order to deal with them. And when we can't do that, we get shamed and blamed for having them and told that it was our fault, right? And we tend to internalize that, right? Thank you very much for your story. And I note that as soon as you told the story about the bed bugs, you also said, perhaps it's my fault that I didn't save, right? Because we internalize that blame and that shame. And one of the things we need to be about is casting off that internalized blame and shame. It is not our fault that we are experiencing what is the inevitable outcome of the systems that we have created in these recent centuries and that we are about to recreate. Another thing that I heard in your stories was the way in which people set groups against each other, right? Those of us who have a common cause, the nurses didn't have to pay, right? So we end up, and I've seen this in Chattanooga, in what is now my hometown, the way in which people who control the housing set groups of tenants against each other so that we keep from uniting. And sometimes that setting against one another is based on racial factors, ethnic factors. Sometimes it has to do with professions, whatever. It's that setting groups against each other that's so dangerous. Now, we heard one story of a fortunate acquisition of permanent housing, right? And I appreciate the fact that you spoke, sir, about your good fortune in doing that and acknowledging that that might not be available to everybody today. But what happens when we put those stories out into the world? The media pick them up, and the media say, see, there's an example of somebody who did everything right. So he's okay. He's a model. What the media does is create the illusion of inclusion, that if we all follow the rules, that we can be included in the benefits of society. And we have to watch out for that, okay? So part of what I'm saying here is that in our stories lie a tremendous font of knowledge on which we can use as fuel to move from our stories of plight to the fight that we have to engage in order to create the kind of world in which our basic human needs are met, in which everyone, like this gentleman here, have that foundation from which we can move into the world. And then, of course, I want to underscore something that Stella said. I have the knowledge. I have experienced this. I have knowledge. I have skills. That's the beginning of one of the most important aspects in our fight, and that is the development of leadership, the knowing that among us we have leaders. They may not be the kind of leaders that we are told are leaders, individuals, right? They're usually tall, by the way, and and have a certain variety of skills and whatnot, and a certain image, and so on and so on. I mean, this is the image of leadership. But we need to be thinking about collective leadership. We need to be thinking about the kinds of skills and experiences we have among us that we can pull together in order to engage in this fight. And the fight is for basic human needs. The fight is for the creation of a world and of communities in which basic human needs are met. That has to be the one thing, that one vision that drives all of us. And by the way, I was telling this to Fiona last night, that is a very seditious concept. How many of you in here have some exposure to social work? Either you're social workers or you have to deal with them. Okay, all right. So, in the 1940s, the United States government commissioned a training manual. They called upon a woman by the name of Charlotte Toll, who was at the University of Chicago, to write a training manual for the massive numbers of social workers that were being hired into the public arena, public social welfare. And she wrote a book, and she titled it Common Human Needs. And the theme of the book was that what social work was about and what society needed to be about was ensuring that we met common human needs. The need for clothing, the need for food, the need for health care, the need for shelter. That book was used as a training manual in public social service arenas in the United States and probably in Canada as well for many, many years. In fact, when I signed on as a welfare worker in 1964, that was the training manual I was given. But I was given it as an historic document because in the 1950s, the American Medical Association got hold of this book, and they said, she's saying that we ought to organize our society in a way that common human needs are met before anything else. That is seditious. So they introduced a resolution into the United States Congress condemning the book as potentially seditious. And that resolution passed without opposition. 100% of the Congress of the United States said that a book that said that common human needs should be the basis of public policy was seditious. The book was removed from publication. It was a government publication, and it was removed from publication. I think if there's anything that social workers can be proud of, it's the fact that our first training manual was burned by the United States government as potentially seditious. So that's something that we need to reclaim. Okay, so much for my reflections for the moment on what we've shared so far, and I hope that we will come back to that as we consider the fight as well as the plight. Now, because I'm an academic, I have an affliction, and that is that I have a tendency to get very theoretical, okay? So I want to ask you, please, to bear with me and take what you can and leave the rest, okay? And I'm going to give you some concrete examples of some things that have worked, but I want to give you a little bit of the theory of why they worked, because that helps us replicate them, okay? And before I do that, I want to tell you one small fact, important fact about USACI, USA-Canada Alliance of Inhabitants. We were formed at the U.S. Social Forum, which was held a little over a year ago in Detroit. We had actually started organizing for it before that as a program of the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign, and then it became independent. But when we first started organizing, it was the U.S. Alliance of Inhabitants. And as we moved through the process at the U.S. Social Forum, two very important things happened. One was that there were people from Canada there, and they said, wait a minute, don't leave us out of this. So it's the U.S.-Canada Alliance of Inhabitants, because we share so much of the common condition and have so much of the opportunity to work together to claim our human right to housing. The other thing was that although the International Alliance of Inhabitants focused on housing, the human right to housing, the First Nation people in the audience said, for us, there is a more fundamental right, and that is the right to our lands. So both the U.S. Alliance of Inhabitants and the International Alliance of Inhabitants have now changed our focus to the right to housing and lands. Right? We are not a social service organization. We are simply a network of organizations that consist of members who are working to claim the right to housing and land. And all of those organizations use whatever strategies and tactics seem appropriate to them and their communities at any given time. So we don't have one program. We are a network of organizations and groups that support each other. The other thing that is unique about the USA Alliance of Inhabitants, and by the way, we're an all-volunteer organization, is that our decisions are made by representatives of organizations that are led by or are directly responsible to people who are directly affected, okay? So we do have advocacy organizations and policy organizations, et cetera, in the network. They get a voice in our deliberations, but they don't get a vote, okay? You have to be directly engaged in the struggle for the right to housing or land in order to have a vote in our organization, or be directly responsible to people who are. So I think that's a very important thing, and I want to come back to that for a minute. Okay, now, here we go. Probably the most important thing that, to me, that I want to say today is that in all of our efforts to gain concessions through law and the promotion of social services, we will fail. But we need to understand why we will fail so that we can change our strategies. We have to be careful always not to get so wrapped up in the tyranny of tactics that we forget what our strategies need to be. Okay, are you with me so far? Okay, so in order to grasp the significance of this, I have to take you back a couple of centuries. I know I don't look that old. I'm only almost a century old, but I need to go back to the 19th century. Okay? Now, and I'm going back specifically to the 19th century in Europe, right? Does anybody happen to remember what happened in the 19th century? What the big change was in the 19th century? Say what? The Industrial Revolution, exactly. Okay, before that, people were pretty much living on the land in small communities under a feudal system, etc. And we think of feudalism as being, just sort of terrible. But as some of us were discussing last night, there was a social contract. The lords and the commoners sort of took care of each other, and so on and so forth. And in fact, we have a social contract in the industrial period also. But I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so here we are. We have the introduction into production and distribution this little thing that's built around a steam engine, right? Right? And what needs to happen then? What needs to happen is you have to have a disciplined workforce working in your factories all in one place, right? So a variety of things contributed, including the enclosures, contributed to getting people off the lands out into the rural areas and into the cities, okay, where they would work as laborers in these factories. Now, that was obviously not completely an easy process, right? There were people who objected to that. There were people who said, wait a minute, we are going there to get these jobs and get some pay for those jobs, and then we buy what we produce, but we don't get the real abundance of what we produce. We only get a little bit of it, okay? And why is it that we can't own these things collectively, okay? So what do you call those people? Yeah, socialists, communists, right? So so there we have in the late 19th century, in the early 20th century, we have these people that are beginning to question that system. But let's stay actually in the 19th century for the moment, all right? Question that system, saying, wait a minute, there's something about this system that doesn't seem fair to us, and there may be another way. And they were very restive. I mean, they were causing problems all over Europe. And I'm not even talking about the kinds of things that were happening in what's now called the United States and Canada at that period, okay? I mean, that was just massive obliteration, right? But in Europe, there was this struggle, right? And the industrialists, along with the governments of Europe, particularly in Germany, which was sort of the center of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, said, wait a minute, we need to put a lid on this social unrest, okay? We need to put a lid on it. We have to control this, okay? And the best way to control this is to make a deal, right? And the part of the deal already existed. The social contract was, you work in my factory, I will pay you wages. With those wages, you can buy the products that you produce, right? I will get the profit. I will reinvest the profit. Our standard of living will go up. We will all benefit, okay? But there were times when that wasn't working so well, right? There were economic crises that happened sometimes as the result of natural, quote, quote, disasters, and sometimes just of general business cycles. So what was the answer? The answer was a social welfare system, a safety net, okay? And that would chill out these communists and socialists that were going around saying, oh my gosh, all right, now if you are unemployed, if the wage earner dies, et cetera, you will have a floor through a social welfare system that would take care of you, a safety net. Now, there were other aspects of the social welfare system also, such as public education, for example, okay? All right, what's the first thing you learn when you go to school? The very first thing you learn?
To read?
Before that?
Right.
Before that?
French.
What is it? Be on time, and when you go through the door, what do you do then? Line up. Exactly. Be on time, line up. That was the function of public education. Prepare the workforce for factory labor. Okay? And it still is. All right. So we had a modicum, as it evolved, a modicum of health care, a modicum of all of the various aspects of the safety net. Now, just let's note this about the safety net, okay? This concept of safety net, where does that come from? Where have you seen the safety net?
Safety net means you're netting together.
No, that's safety net. That's a great idea. That's what we want to go to. Okay, a safety net. Where do you see a safety net? In the circus, exactly. Under the trapeze artists and so on and so forth. And when do you need a safety net?
When you're performing,
When you're performing, and what happens?
then you,
You fall. You make a mistake. Okay? You need a safety net when you make a mistake. So right from the beginning, this very concept of safety net implies that you are at fault for needing this kind of support. You got it? Okay? So all of this sort of comes together. You've got the social welfare system emerging to chill out social unrest, to keep people barely alive, and at the same time you're telling them it's their fault that they need it in the first place. Okay? Now, as the social welfare system evolved, housing became part of that safety net. Now, in part, we can say, okay, people were organizing to gain the basic necessities of life, and that's true. They were hard won, even to the point of death sometimes. But it was also true that every time the state made a concession, such as public housing, it served the interests of the corporations, the owners of the means of production. Okay? One of the neat things for the rulers, the powers that be, was that public housing and the support of private housing, mortgages, right, provided stability for a workforce. So we don't want to say that our efforts were meaningless. None of this would have happened had we not fought and organized for rights. At the same time, they also wouldn't have happened if they hadn't met the needs of the people who really control the economic conditions under which we live, right? And we need to keep that in mind. So all of this worked sort of fairly well. This social contract, this deal with the devil that we made, up to a certain point. And the watershed moment happened in the 1970s. Okay? Does anybody remember what some of the most significant happenings were in the 1970s?
Oil crisis.
The oil crisis. Okay, what else?
the hippie movement.
The hippie movement. That's right. The hippie movement. Yeah, there's the fight. Okay, what else?
They could smoke marijuana and weed and everything.
Yeah.
Alcohol.
Yeah, okay, the hippie movement. What else? So that was a major cultural event. What else? Yes.
Well, I think one of the things is that the corporate sector realized that they no longer had to follow the social contract.
Yes, exactly. And why didn't they? Okay, this is the thing. They realized that they didn't have to follow the social contract because they did not require the kind of labor that they required in the Industrial Revolution. What happened in the 1970s was that we moved from the industrial age to the electronic age. All right? In the early 1970s, robots were introduced to the factory floor. All right? And computers became a primary mechanism for the production and distribution of goods and services. All right? Now, let's see. In your story, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, ma'am, with the red and white striped shirt. Yes, you. You with the pen in your hand. Yes, bedbugs. Bedbug lady. Yes, you. Yeah. Carol, thank you. Okay, you were saying that you gave your daughter a rude awakening, okay? That she thought she was really well off, okay? And you showed her that she was really quite marginal, right? And that is exactly the primary character of this period that we have disrupted that relationship between those of us who have, in one way or another, sold our labor and those people who used our labor to create profit. That relationship was ended as a result of the introduction of computers and robots into the productive and distribution system, all right? In other words, to put it simply, we no longer need the amount of human labor that we did. We don't need those jobs. The job crisis is not so much about the outsourcing of jobs to other nations. It's about the fact that we no longer need all of those jobs in order to produce what we need in the marketplace. And in fact, today, most of the wealth that's being produced is not being produced as a result of the production of goods to meet human needs or human wants. The goods are being produced by, or the wealth is being produced by investments, by people who have buying up from other people who have, right? So this is a tremendously important thing, because what it has done is it has created a new class of dispossessed people. People who are no longer needed in the process of production and distribution. People who no longer will have the money that we need in order to meet our basic human needs. That new class of dispossessed consists of those people whose relationship with labor has been disrupted forever. Now, it's not Joe and Tom and Nancy, etc. It's a sector of the population. People will move in and out of it, but the important thing is that there is a sector of the population that is, quote, superfluous. Okay? Just superfluous. That includes, I mean, if we wonder why it is that people are so, quote, mean to poor people, it's because poor people are superfluous. Right? And, by the way, those of us who have made our living as social workers also become superfluous. Okay? We need to be aware of that. Okay, so are you with me still so far? I mean, I'm just kind of going on here. Does this make any sense to you? All right? Now, I've been giving this speech, by the way, now for exactly like this, for about 10 years. Right? And people say, she's out in left field, she doesn't know what she's talking about, she's just talking about a fantasy world, and so on and so forth. Well, lo and behold, a couple of weeks ago, there was a book published by two professors from MIT saying exactly what I am saying to you. Exactly the same thing. That these jobs are gone forever. Okay? So, and their solution is that we have to start having some hard conversations. Well, I want to take us one step further. We don't just have to have some conversations. We need to start organizing. And we need to start organizing not out of the sense that we are going to beg for our safety net back, but for the fact that we are going to have to force the change that has to take place if we're not going to become annihilated. Huge sections of our populations are not going to become completely annihilated. And I think you see from the reaction to the Occupy Wall Streets that are happening all over the world, the tremendous violence that has been unleashed on nonviolent occupiers, that this is not going to be easy. It's going to be very, very difficult. I just got back from Iceland, by the way, as a matter of fact, and to me it was so interesting that people, in talking about the United States with me there, said, well, your government is so fascistic. You're living in such a fascistic environment. you know? And I thought, I agree with that, but we don't say that. We don't say that out loud. There's something so scary about that. But if you think about the degree of surveillance and fear that is being instilled, the way we are set against one another, those are characteristics of a fascistic environment. So we got to get real about that. So, bringing it back to housing now, okay? If this is the condition in which we need to be struggling for the human right to housing and land, what are the kinds of things that can be done that go beyond our attempts to reconstruct a safety net that has no longer any use for the people who own the means that we need in order to meet our basic human needs, right? What can we do that is going to go beyond asking for concessions that are no longer going to come? Okay, the first thing we have to do is to continue to fight for those concessions, okay? We can't give up the fight. The difference in the way we have to fight, one difference is we have to continue fighting for the concessions, the provisions to meet our basic human needs, but with the understanding that we are not going to win, until there is a fundamental change in the way in which we meet basic human needs. But we have to keep fighting for it because we all want to believe that we can find a way without the kind of disruption and danger that is most likely to come, right? So we want to continue doing that. And we want to continue, every time we fail, to say, why are we failing? Is it because our tactics were no good? Or is it because our strategies were no good? Is it because we failed to organize effectively? Or is it because of that plus the kinds of barriers that we're facing that we never faced before? Okay? So let me give you some examples of people, organizations that are members of the USA, Canada of Alliance of Inhabitants that are doing that fit with this kind of analysis, that go beyond the search for ways to mend the safety net. The National Alliance of HUD Tenants focuses and mobilizes its people to challenge the budget cuts that are taking place in the United States on the federal level. And you're having the same kind of battle here in Canada. Of course, they are not winning. But in the process of organizing the folks to do that, they are helping people understand why they're not winning. They're helping people understand, for example, that the most fundamental problem that they're facing is not the lack of numbers of senators and representatives that will vote on their behalf, but rather it is the privatization of the basic needs, of basic human needs. The commodification of basic human needs. Every human need becomes a commodity that gets sold in the marketplace, okay? And most increasingly through private networks. So whether it's healthcare, housing, food, whatever, it becomes a commodity sold through a private network. Now, what's happening in the United States, and probably is happening or is about to happen in Canada, is that what had been public housing is being, the mortgages that were made in order to develop that housing some years ago are expiring, and that housing is being sold to private investors, okay? So they are looking for ways to make money. Now, in my town, for example, in Chattanooga, we have a public housing, quote, quote, ghetto, right? That doesn't look anything like a ghetto. The housing, the area is beautiful. It's full of gardens and ancient trees, and there are high rises and low rises. It's just absolutely beautiful. It overlooks the mountains and the river. It's stunning. When it was developed 30 and 40 years ago, that was on the edge of an industrial area. Nobody wanted to be there. But now industry has moved out, okay? It's been replaced by electronic stuff, right? Industry has moved out. This has become prime areas. So now that the mortgages are about to end, the powers that be are looking for ways to get people out of there. And one of the ways they're doing it is through the bed bug stuff, by the way, okay? The places are just riddled with bed bugs, and they won't take care of it. And they're blaming people for bringing the bed bugs in, okay? Any tiny little infraction, any effort to organize is met with a conscious effort to get rid of the people who have either committed some kind of infraction or are organizing, right? Because they want to privatize what is a public commodity. So the National Alliance of HUD Tenants is helping people understand what they're up against so that they don't give up when their senators don't vote for them, okay? They are politicizing this sector of the population, and that's what's important. Okay. Another example, Take Back the Land. Take Back the Land is a network of organizations in the United States that is doing foreclosure resistance. The level of foreclosures in the United States is absolutely out of sight, and I'm sure it is here too in Canada, is it not?
Yeah.
I mean, just, not yet, but it's coming, okay? I mean, foreclosure, there's millions and millions and millions of people losing their homes. And by the way, most of the people who are losing their homes are people that are in that sector of the population that I described as the new class. They are people who have lost their jobs, are not going to get other jobs, or if they do, they're going to work for 2 and 3 jobs for practically no wages, not enough to maintain their mortgages, okay? So Take Back the Land is helping people stay in their homes by occupying those properties. If those properties have been subsidized in any way, directly or indirectly, by the government, Take Back the Land is saying these are public properties. We paid for them. The public paid for them. Okay? If the mortgage is held by a bank that got bailed out in the multi-billion-dollar bailouts, those are public properties, and we are taking them back. All right? So obviously they are facing the police, they are facing the courts, but they are occupying these properties. And even if they occupy them for only a couple of days, weeks, or months, they are demonstrating to the world that there is more to the story than the failure of people to pay their mortgages. They are demonstrating to the world the nature of the shift in our economy, and they are introducing the notion that we, the people, own those properties and we have a right to take them back. Now that's new thinking, okay? And it's the kind of new thinking that can move us forward. One of the Take Back the Land efforts was, and this takes us to another point, is up in Rochester, New York. And, you know, Rochester is a little town about the same size as Regina. I mean, basically a small town up in the north part of New York. And Take Back the Land organized to take back a house for this particular woman, and she wasn't getting a whole lot of support, so they called for help for the International Alliance of Inhabitants. And we started asking people to take 5 minutes to call the sheriff's office, call the member of the House of Representatives, call the mayor, call all these people and say, guess what? You are in violation of the International Covenant on Human Rights, okay? And we got the international coordinator of the International Alliance of Inhabitants to call from Italy and say, you are in violation of the following international covenants, right? And one of the people he called was the woman who was the local representative in the House of Representatives, and she got very nervous about the fact that that Rochester was in the international spotlight, and she called the bank and said, "You better renegotiate this." Right? So, networking, calling upon your network is so important. Okay, another one, public housing. In New Orleans and Chicago in particular, there are battles for public housing. Public housing is being torn down. It's not just, they don't just move in and move people out the way they used to, okay? What happens is they pick off people one family at a time, one person at a time, and they board up the apartment. And then they say, oh, we don't have the money to fix up those apartments. So then when they get most of the apartments boarded up, then they say, oh, the place is crime-ridden, we can't maintain it, and so on and so forth, so we're just going to have to do something else. So they give people Section 8 vouchers, but of course there aren't enough houses for Section 8 vouchers. Section 8 vouchers is where the landlord gets the market value of the apartment, but the tenant pays only a third of his or her income. You probably have something like that too. Okay, so the fight for public housing is absolutely essential because we must maintain the principle that housing needs to be and is by right a public benefit, not a private commodity. Another thing, the Western Regional Action Coalition project, WRAP, has an initiative called House Keys Not Handcuffs. Okay? This initiative organizes around homelessness. People who are homeless, along with their allies, do all kinds of things, marches, takeovers, etc., under the slogan, House Keys Not Handcuffs. And what they're doing there is exposing the criminalization of homelessness and poverty. Okay? I mean, as you know, I hope you know, in the United States, and I don't know about Canada, but in the United States, you can be and will be regularly arrested and jailed for meeting such basic human needs as going to the bathroom. Okay? And increasingly, you're arrested or cited not only by the public police, but by the business improvement districts, private police forces. Okay? Businesses are hiring private police forces to rid our areas, including this area right around here, right, of homeless people. So it is absolute criminalization of poverty that we're seeing. And so House Keys Not Handcuffs is promoting the solution. House keys, not handcuffs. Finally, and I could give you some more, but this one is absolutely my favorite. I'm here today because Sherry Honkala of the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign couldn't be here, okay? And the reason she can't be here is that next week is the election for sheriff of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And Sherry is running for sheriff, okay? This woman who is formerly homeless and has been organizing to end poverty for over 20 years is running as the people's sheriff. Now, why is this important? She's going to lose. As I said, we need to know we're going to lose. But in the process of the struggle, in the process of the fight, we need to expose the barriers, organize the people to fight those barriers, and project the alternative, okay? Sherry's platform is zero evictions. If I am elected sheriff, I will be the people's sheriff. I will not enforce any foreclosure notice. Any property that has been foreclosed, I will take over, and I will create community centers, rehabilitation centers, public gardens. And in doing this, she is not only putting forward this notion of a world of zero evictions and the right to housing and land, she is also doing this as part of an independent political motion, breaking away. In the United States, we have Republicans and Democrats. We don't have a parliamentary system. We just have the two major parties. And it is essential that people who are no longer represented by those two parties, both of which are in the hands of corporations, organize in our own interest. So she is saying a world of zero evictions, and we are achieving that through our political action. Okay? So those are some examples of what people are doing. And now, what I'd like to do is to invite you to come up with some things that you might be able to do here in Regina around claiming your right to housing and land, okay? And in this exercise, I want to ask you to consider 10 criteria for the kinds of actions that will take us beyond pleading for a return to a safety net that we need to know is gone forever, okay? As I analyze the kinds of actions that are working to move us beyond that, I discovered, well, I think, at least 10 characteristics. Number one, they engage in and are accountable to people who are directly affected by the failure to meet, the public failure to meet basic human needs, in this case, housing. Okay? Two, they are grounded in an analysis of the opportunities and the barriers presented by this historical moment, this change from the industrial era to the electronic era. And by the way, I left out something terribly, terribly important. I said that, this is problematic because it creates this new class of dispossessed, but it also provides us with a tremendous opportunity. We don't need labor in the way that we needed labor in order to produce what we need in order to survive. We are truly at the cusp of an age of abundance, right? We can produce housing, food, clothing, health care. We can do all of this without the intensive grinding labor that we needed in the past. Yeah, now somebody's still going to have to take out the garbage. Somebody's still going to have to dig the ditch. But as these two fellows from MIT are demonstrating, even surgery can be done today by robots. I had to let my son know about that. He's a surgeon. So he's a trauma surgeon. He said, "Don't worry, Mom, we still have a lot of trauma." So, and that's true. But this is an age of abundance. This is an age of plenty. And if we buy into the notion that our resources are scarce and therefore we can't do it, we have to give lie to that notion. It is a lie, and we have to say so, okay? So we have to be grounded in an analysis of the opportunities as well as the barriers that are presented by this moment, and therefore we have to study this moment. Okay, next thing. We have to present a vision. What will exist that does not now exist? That is the ultimate criterion. We have to be able to say at the beginning, what will exist that does not now exist when we take on this campaign? The fourth thing, we need to promote the building blocks of the solution. We need, the building blocks of the solution are that the solution meets basic human needs, that it reclaims the commons. What is public becomes public, and it ruptures the relationship between corporations and governments. It ruptures that relationship, which, by the way, I saw symbolically today. I went to get a cup of coffee just before we started, and I was walking past the park down here, okay? And I noticed that when the sun comes up in the morning, the municipal building, the government building, is in the shadow of the banking towers. There it is. So next time you walk down there, notice that, okay? The government is the handmaiden of the corporations, and we need to rupture that relationship. We need to say, government is about meeting the needs of people, the people, not the corporations. And every time we challenge that, we move another step forward. So those are three of the building blocks of a solution. Next thing. We need to limit our force. Now, with the occupations, I mean, I know, you all know that there are people in every occupation that's going on right now who really get off on disruption, on disruptive tactics, you know? And it's a problem. I mean, it's wonderful in so many of the occupations that people are insisting upon nonviolence, okay? Because, well, I don't have to explain to you why violence doesn't work, okay? But when people lose focus and say, we've got to do this because we've got to act, then we need to ask the question, again, what will exist at the end of this action that does not now exist? Because then it becomes pretty clear that if you engage in violence, it's not going to happen, okay? The next. A successful action engages all dimensions of the human experience. Art, music, theater, poetry, slogans, dance, photography. Okay? Those are the things that move people. Right? You know, I was last night we were having dinner with people who had experienced in Chile the suppression, the violent suppression of the people in the 1970s. And of course, their movement was not completely defeated, but interrupted by the CIA assassination of Allende. But millions and millions and millions of people in Chile, and especially in Argentina and other parts of South America, mobilized to claim their rights and restore their democracy. And one of the most powerful things that brought them together was music, Nueva Canción, right? And I was thinking last night when I was home of the image of Leon Gieco, who used to sing this anthem of the revolution that simply went, I only ask God to help me not accept injustice. And I ask God that I not leave this world without having done something about this injustice, right? That song was so motivating and so powerful that he was forbidden to sing it. So when he gave a concert, instead of singing it, he would just ask people to clap. And people would hear, solo le pido a Dios, right? They would hear the music and the anthem while they were clapping. And the government could not stop him from asking people to clap, okay? They could forbid him to sing, but they couldn't stop him from doing that. So those are the kinds of things, or, you know, the image of young children singing "We Shall Overcome," you know, in the civil rights movement. These things are tremendously important. So photography, music, poetry, all of these things. Your stories, you were talking, Stella, about writing your story, about living in a cardboard box. These things are fuel for the movement, right? Okay, related to that is messaging for the media. And not only the mainstream media, but the development of alternative media. We have to have our own newspapers. We have to have our own broadsides. You know, we now have the wonderful benefit of social networking, and we need to use that. I just found out today I'm on YouTube. I didn't know that. Okay, we need to use those things. Okay. And then networking. We need especially to network with members of the new class. These are the people who no longer have a stake in the system. You know, Martin Luther King used to talk about the unsettling force. He said that people who are poor have no stake in the system, and therefore, if organized and educated and mobilized, they can become the unsettling force that will mobilize the world toward greater justice. Now, that didn't happen out of the civil rights movement for a whole lot of reasons that we don't have to go into right now, okay? But right now we can say that this new class of dispossessed is the new unsettling force, okay? They have no stake in the system. There is no answer within the current system to their plight. Right? So that's why it is so important that Occupy, for example, is all over the world, is making alliances with labor, right? Because it's labor that is losing out. Okay. The next thing is organizing in the mediating structures. Who knows what a mediating structure is? You know what a mediating structure is? What is it, Stella?
Mediator, you have people, one person sits there and listens, and the judge comes together and they mediate, and we discuss.
Okay, what I have in mind is related to that. Okay, it's a little bit different. Let me show the way it's different, but it is absolutely related to that. Think in terms of the relationships that shape our lives. Okay? The relationships that shape our lives are those intimate relationships with our friends, our family, etc., right? And then there are also relationships, there are things that go on in the superstructure that also shape our lives, you know, in the economy, the government, etc., etc. But where we act to change those systems up there are in those structures in between, okay, where we have personal relationships with people, but those organizations in which we have those relationships have an influence on what happens in the larger sector, okay? What are those? School boards, clubs, service clubs, right? Churches, alumni associations, those groups where we are bound together by interpersonal relationships, but they are the basis for mobilizing to change the larger systems. And if you have any doubt about this, look at what has happened in the United States and in Canada in the last 20 years. This notion of mediated structures was developed in conservative think tanks and was used as the strategy by conservative political forces to take over and get their message into the Rotary clubs, the churches, the school boards, etc., okay, where people listen because they have personal relationships. So mediating structures. And finally, the next criterion is reframing, politicizing every issue, reframing the issue from one of the need for social services to the need to claim rights and meet basic human needs. Rights are grounded in basic human needs, okay? So while we need to take a position on rent control, for example, we need to realize that rent control is not the answer. The answer is claiming the public right to housing, right? It's a very different framework. So we can fight for rent control, but we're going to lose. And when we lose, we need to realize that the reason we're losing is that there is a structural denial of our human rights, and we need to go for those. So those are 10 things, and